Hello, and welcome to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit.
Can I ask you a question, fundraiser? When it comes to crunch time for your fundraising campaigns, do you feel intense pressure to find a poster child for your nonprofit, capture their iconic story, and then optimize it to deliver maximum donations? Listen to me when I say that's a daunting task for anyone. And it's no wonder storytelling stresses nonprofits out. But there is a way, and you're about to hear the secret directly from one of the storytelling greats. Olga M. Woltman has the key to discovering, creating, and distributing stories that will compel connections and keep donors coming back time after time. Spoiler alert, it doesn't involve parading a poster child around, invading your client's privacy, or making something up. Olga is a leader in digital fundraising and marketing, and the founder of Lemon Skies, a strategic nonprofit agency that takes communications and turns them into conversations. Today, she's got the scoop for us on how to ethically and empathetically uncover the captivating stories just beneath the surface, weave relevant impact stats and authentic conversations throughout, and choose the perfect moment to release them for incredible impact.
It is your number one priority to ensure that your business can continue to deliver on its mission, whether it's this year, next year, and beyond.
So we're creating this inclusive environment, building between diverse communities to ensure that our young people can thrive.
I'm always so baffled when I do webinars. There's always somebody at the end who raises their hand and says, I'm the development director. Should I have access to the budget? I'm always like, yes, you've got to know that.
The best thing you can ever do as a nonprofit leader is spend as much money as possible on your story.
Then you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
That is unacceptable, and that is not the way to run a board.
The best thing that we can do is just raise as much money as possible and then give it to the people around the world.
If you're going to be sustainable, you have to have a multi-channel strategy to reach all of these different generations of donors however they want to be reached.
One of the principal values that we carry as an organization is to lift grace over guilt. And we believe that grace is the greatest agent for change that anyone can ever experience.
We all need each other in terms of other nonprofits working together to solve things.
The more nonprofits can give their donor base that experience of the impact that's being made on the ground level, there's nothing else that you have to give someone. This is Nonstop Nonprofit.
Hello, Nonstop Nonprofit podcast listeners. This is David Schwab, and today I am excited to welcome our guest, Olga Woltman. Olga is a leader at the ALS Foundation, a leader on the board of directors at her local chapter of the Special Olympics, and she also owns her own storytelling and fundraising consulting agency. So Olga has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to storytelling and fundraising and people leadership. And I'm really excited to have Olga on today. We have a great conversation ahead for us. But Olga, thank you again for joining. To start, would you just mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Thank you, David, for having me here. Yes, I think you captured some of my background. My professional expertise is entirely in nonprofit sector, and storytelling, messaging, communications, and marrying those with empathy and people is really my specialty area.
So starting off, this is a question I ask all of our guests. What is it about the nonprofit world that brought you in? And then, I mean, you've been in the sector for a long time now. Not only what brought you in, but what has kept you in?
You know, I think the what kept me in is probably the easier part to answer. Once you start working for a nonprofit and you're seeing an impact and you're tying your day-to-day work to outcomes and the impact you're making, it's really something that just keeps you coming back. I ended up in the nonprofit sector almost accidentally. I moved to Washington, D.C. after graduation, and that was where I got my first job, not surprisingly, out of college, and just really sort of enjoyed it and appreciated doing it. So I can't imagine doing anything else.
Awesome. So Olga, as we were first meeting and preparing for this podcast episode, you gave me a little bit more detail about your background and your experience, and you spend a lot of time on the people side, specifically internally at nonprofit organizations. So as you've built your career, what was it about the people side of nonprofit leadership and nonprofit management that got you so interested to focus your efforts there?
I think some of it is natural inclination for me to really relate to humans and try and see why we do what we do. But when I think about the work of nonprofit organizations, technology and strategy, all of those matter greatly, but it's ultimately the people that are the fuel that drive outcomes. So to not really lean into that and not to pay attention to that aspect of the nonprofit work just seems like missing a pretty huge, pretty critical piece of the puzzle. So it's really sort of embracing that and thinking about how we work together and how do we motivate people and how do we engage constituents that we work with. To me, it's sort of one continuum. It's not delineating employees versus people we serve. It's really kind of implying that emotional intelligence and emotional IQ to the work we're doing.
Awesome. That's really interesting. But also, I want to dig a little deeper there because, you've got this great ability to tell stories, but also this empathy for people. I feel like that's translated itself into your ability to uniquely communicate the impact that an organization makes. The way that you often refer to it is people-focused storytelling. Could you, just for the sake of our audience and the listeners, define a little bit of what people-focused storytelling is?
Well, I think when we think about stories and the storyline and the plot line of the story, it's really about the human experience. It's not a linear telling of what happened and what happened next. It's the journey of the individual that's impacted along the way. When I talk about storytelling and when I sit down to write, or whether it's an email communication or messaging points or overarching strategy, it's really just seeing it from that perspective and allowing yourself to experience it along the way. So, and knowing that it brings up emotions as you go through that process, but that tends to generate probably the strongest, most authentic outcome, because anybody can string together narrative, but to really add that feel to it, it's really focusing on what compels you, what touches you as you're going through the storytelling.
So, Olga, I don't know, you probably don't know this, but there's a conference coming up. This is perfect timing for this conversation because in a couple weeks, I'll be going out to the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference, where I have the opportunity to give a session about storytelling and communicating. And the topic we'll be presenting on is stories move, but numbers prove. And I'm a performance marketing guy. I hyper focus on the numbers. To me, if you show me change over time or impact through numbers, like that's what gets me motivated. But I also realize that's not the only way to tell stories and the only way to show impact. So this is almost to help me prepare for the session that I'll be leading along with another member of my team. But how can focusing on the people element of storytelling make a difference when you're thinking about communicating the impact that your organization makes?
So there's two elements to what you're describing, David. When I think about measuring the impact of storytelling, obviously it matters. If we told a great story, but it generates no return on it, as a business person, you have to really consider, why are we doing this? But I do think it's looking at a longer view in how we're connecting donors and constituents to the cause and to the mission, because it's not going to be sporadic. You tell the story and you see a spike in giving, you might, but the point is over time to build that affinity and to build that connection. But when we think about compelling case for support, compelling case to engage somebody in an organization or mission, numbers only tell a partial story. Our brains are really wired for storytelling, so they invoke stronger emotions. We're rooting for the outcome. We're much more invested. So stories are really an illustration of that impact. So the numbers on their own just simply do not connect with us in the same way. And it's combining those two to really build that connection over time.
I think it's what you're saying is so important to remember as we're building, not just like we have to write fundraising appeals. Like we are driven by the generosity of others. That's how we generate revenue and generate the ability to grow impact at our organizations. But it's so important to remember that you can't sacrifice the core of your organization and the core message and the core story that your organization is telling just for the sake of driving revenue for like one campaign. Like you have to be mindful that does this campaign, does this appeal, does this ad, does this message ladder up into my bigger, oftentimes we call it brand story or brand arc, right? Does what I'm saying here connect to what I've been saying all year? And if not, am I choosing specifically to break the way that I normally talk about what we do? Like, and this kind of, I'm leading us kind of into my next question, specifically because a lot of organizations I'm talking to right now are like, heads down, it's time. We got to write our giving season fundraising appeals, right? Like we're Giving Tuesday, core holidays, and year end. Like we're planning for the final 6 weeks of the year. We know we're going to raise, in some cases as much as 50% of our revenue in the last 6 weeks of the year, which is crazy to think about. That is a different conversation entirely. But as organizations set their minds on that, it's really easy to get focused on like, I've got to do everything I can to drive numbers now, revenue now, impact now. I got to create urgency. I've got to create a need. I've got to connect the need. I've got to tell stories. There's so much that fundraisers have to do when it comes to telling good stories as we approach the core 6-week cycle of fundraising. I want to dig into that a little bit because I think you're going to have a really unique perspective here. My first question as we come into that is, how do we pick the stories to tell when we know that it is game time and it really matters? We have to tell our most powerful stories. We have to show our biggest impact. We have to create the most, not just emotive, but logical connection to why someone should give and why someone should give to us now when every other organization is trying to do the same thing. So my first question with that context is like, how do we pick the right stories for the right time?
So I'm going to cite Supreme Court here. I think with impactful stories, when you see it, you know it. There are some stories that just stick with you and you can't quite pinpoint, is it a particular word or is it something about the individual that's being featured? But there's something about it that just stirs emotion. And that story may be different for you than it is for me, but I tend to work best with the stories that I personally feel compelled and connected with. And then I think the other piece to look at is to redefine what a story is. It's not a traditional definition where there's a very clear introduction and sequential series of events and a very clear conclusion to the story. In terms of fundraising stories, it's really a vignette, it's a snapshot, it's not full view. So it's almost what you say matters, but also what you leave out matters. It's taking that little snippet to illustrate and not to lead donor or constituent down the path where they're very compelled, but they lose sight of why they're hearing the story in the first place. So I think just making sure that there's that strong connection to the mission and strong connection to why I should make a contribution that's so logical that the only next step is to really contribute and support the cause.
So often I run into the issues like, we don't have stories to tell. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't have stories to tell? Right? Like, you're literally changing lives. It doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what type of organization you are impacting lives in some capacity, right? We've already told all the stories we've captured this year. I'm like, what do you mean? And this gets into something that I've been pushing with our team at Funraise is resonance, right? Like as a fundraiser, we go, okay, I told that story, I can't use it again. Because it's like, I can't just say the same thing over and over again. I can't ask for the same thing over again. We're trained like, hey, you use it. It's like that flash in the pan, one and done. What I want to get is your take on repurposing good stories and building resonance with a story, maybe approaching it in different ways. Or oftentimes we think in the advertising side, we use the term frequency. How many times has someone heard this message or seen this ad before it fatigues? So in your perspective and your expertise, what is that like resonance and cadence of telling a story? How many times can you tell a story before it fatigues or before you have to move on to something else?
I love this question so much. And whenever somebody tells me we don't have stories, I just really think it's time to do a training for staff on how to gather stories. The greatest stories start with uncomfortable questions. Mm-hmm. When you're interviewing a subject or you're talking to one of the employees on the front lines, once you start asking questions about how they feel in the moment or what something meant to them or what their dreams and aspirations are. So it's really digging past the surface and going a little bit deeper. That's when you start identifying the true gold threads. In terms of frequency, I think there's this undue pressure on what a story entails. So I think resistance to collecting news stories usually stems from thinking that it's something very huge in nature. And sometimes a simple 20-minute conversation is all you need to get that nugget that you're looking for. In terms of frequency, I think once somebody starts being recognized, if their story is very, very unique, that's when I think you're saturating the market a little bit, because it starts feeling like a poster child syndrome. And that's where you really need to mix it up. But I think it's taking different element of the story and spotlighting a different aspect of it, or maybe changing the angle. I think the other piece to consider is also how long a story has been in rotation, because especially with organizations that may be working with children's population, I've encountered that where a story of an 8-year-old that's wonderful and resonant, by the time that child is 15 or 16 years old, they may not want to be the poster child for the cause. So there's a little bit of that ethical consideration to play a role. But I think, and I'm not trying to sidestep your question on frequency, but I think once you start removing the pressure of story being this epic telling, and it just really becomes a small vignette and small insight on what something means, how your mission is put into action, it feels like a much more surmountable challenge.
No, I love that answer, because I think it really gets to the crux of the issue is fundraisers and marketers and storytellers at nonprofits feel like they have to go out and find this like captivating, iconic, amazing story. And the thought of even getting started doing that, or like even as simple as like, I got to go line up 15 interviews and take my whole day and go find the people and record them. It's blocking when you think about like, I've got to go do this so that I can hope to find this. But really I just have to go be ready to engage with people and listen well and turn what they say into something that I already know my donors and my constituents and my volunteers, my supporters are going to care about.
Yeah, I would just add, it's not stopping. It's reporting of what happened if you just share what happened. To tell a story, you really need to go beyond that. This happened and this is what it meant to me. This occurred and here's how my family was impacted. So I think it's going just that little bit further. And I don't know why we're so uncomfortable asking about feelings and asking about emotions and asking about people's aspirations. But that's where you really generate the story, as opposed to a simple reporting that's very, very straightforward. Here's what happened. Things were okay. And then they got more okay. And everyone was okay ever after. So.
So Olga, one of the things you touched on was the poster child, or the flagship, the story that becomes the anchor of an appeal or a campaign or a season. But if you're not careful, it becomes like your whole fundraising identity. And that one story, you live or die by one story. There's a lot to unpack there, but specifically what I want to unpack, because I hear so much fear and opposition to using stories because people aren't confident that they're telling the stories the right way or doing them justice. But one of the things I really want to get your take on is, how do we tell the story of impact from the person's perspective who was impacted, or from the community, or whatever that impact was? How do we tell that story well, ethically, and in a way that is respectful and responsible?
Well, I think it's not tokenizing and trying to let their voice shine through. Some organizations will actually use first-person narrative, which is a perfectly great approach to it. But I think it's the empathy piece that I keep coming back to, and not telling the story as you would as an outsider, but telling the story in the way that particular person might be sharing it. So, if it's a story of a child, they sound different than a grown-up fundraiser. So it's just making sure that you're allowing some of that to shine through. And it could be the entire narrative. It could be a quote. Goes without saying, permission is always really vital. And your point on ethics is a very important one, to make sure that we're capturing stories of people who want to share it and they want to make a difference for an organization or a cause that helped them, but making sure that it's true to how they see it.
I want to pause for a minute and introduce another trending topic in the nonprofit sphere. Asset-based giving is largely an untapped tool in the fundraiser's toolbox. And until recently, it was a lever most organizations couldn't afford to pull. But as technology increases, the ability to give donors a chance to give out of their wealth to the cause that they already care so deeply about is making it as easy for a donor to give an asset-based gift as a credit card gift. Take a quick listen to Steve Latham, founder and CEO of Donate Stock, one of our partners here at Funraise, as he explains the value of asset-based giving, how it's easier than ever to allow donors to give out of their wealth rather than their wallets, and how technology is enabling more organizations like yours to give more opportunities for donors to lean in to the causes they care so deeply about.
Hi, I'm Steve Latham, co-founder and CEO of Donate Stock, and I'm here to talk to you about how we're making stock gifting easy and accessible for all Funraise nonprofit customers. For decades, stock gifting has been a 1% solution. The wealthiest households giving stock to the largest nonprofits and educational institutions and foundations. It was historically very difficult for small nonprofits to participate in stock gifting, and it's always been a very difficult, tedious process for donors to execute stock gifts. Today, it's a very different story as we've made it easy and accessible for all donors and all nonprofits. So first of all, why stock? First of all, it's the most tax advantaged way for donors to give. When they donate stock instead of cash, they actually can avoid the capital gains tax they would have otherwise incurred if they'd sold it, and they can pass that on to you. So the nonprofits get larger pre-tax stock gifts. It's also the most widely held financial asset, and where most households have their assets concentrated, their wealth is in their investment account. It's in their stocks, mutual funds, ETFs. It's not in their checking account. It's not in their credit cards. So this represents a massive untapped source of funding that now is actually quite accessible for all nonprofits. And like I said, we've made it really easy for Funraise customers now to activate stock gifting inside Funraise and make it easy for your donors to make tax advantage stock gifts. Some of the issues that historically made stock gifting hard were for donors, a lack of awareness, and just a very painstaking manual process to execute stock gifts. That was my experience 15 years ago when I tried to make a stock gift. It was such a painful experience that I never did it again. And it was really that inspiration in 2020 that led us to realize that there was a big opportunity to help nonprofits by unlocking stock gift, by making it easy for the donors as well as the nonprofits. It's also been challenging for nonprofits, even those that can get a brokerage account, which is meaning the larger ones. They really struggle with processing stock gifts. One, it's a lot of work. It's a very manual intensive process. Multiple people have to touch every stock gift. Number two, there's no information about the donor. That's one of the biggest challenges. Even though the donor filled out paperwork to send their stock to that brokerage account on behalf of the nonprofit, their information doesn't travel with the stock. So nonprofits start receiving stock gifts in a brokerage account. They don't know who it came from. The donors assume they know because they fill out some paperwork. And so you have a big problem that the donors are not getting acknowledged because the nonprofits don't know they gave them stock. So those are the issues that we confronted a few years ago. I realized, well, if we could build a better way to make it easy for donors to execute gift in minutes instead of hours or days, and for nonprofits to streamline and automate the process of receiving, selling, acknowledging, and processing stock gifts, then we can really unlock a lot of value for nonprofits, and as well as make it easier for more tax advantage ways for giving for donors. So that's what we do. We think of us as PayPal for stock gifting. It's an easy pop-up widget that allows a donor to execute a gift in minutes. We then process that. We can send the stock to the brokerage account for a 501c3 that we manage, Donate Stock Charitable. That allows us then to convert the stock to cash, send it directly to you. So no brokerage required, no fuss, no hassle. It's really easy. And now it's in your platform as a Funraise customer. And best of all, there's no cost to activate it. You literally can activate it in your giving form in minutes, and then we can start processing these gifts for you. We also arm you with the content to go educate your donors, your board, your communities, the assets through email, web content, a button for your site, for your ways to give page, as well as social posts and other collateral and campaigns that we can arm you with to go out and educate your donors. So we can help make donors aware that stock gifting is easy, allow you to harvest a large portion of your donors' investment accounts where their wealth is concentrated, and unlock a whole new source of funding for nonprofits. So it's really easy. Again, you can activate it inside Funraise. You can come to donatestock.com to learn more. And we look forward to helping you buck the trend and make the most of this Q4 giving season.
The Donate Stock and Funraise integration makes it easier than ever for organizations like yours to empower donors to make bigger, more meaningful gifts than ever before. And now, let's get back to the conversation. I want to kind of redirect us a little bit back to same topic, but thinking back to as we build a year-end messaging strategy or that like vital giving, final push, giving season push messaging strategy, getting super tactical. Let's say, we have 4 appeals planned for that like Giving Tuesday, December, and year-end timeframe. We got 4 appeals planned. We have 2 stories. We want to make the most out of the stories that we have, how would you go about using bits and pieces of the stories and intertwining them with impact statistics and mission updates and things like that? How would you go build that messaging strategy for that time frame, knowing, hey, this is to be our biggest impact yet?
Yeah, and year end is a little bit unique because it is the time that we've conditioned, I suppose, donors to contribute. So the story in that case serves not as a reason, but more as a validation to contribute. People are a little bit more primed to think about giving, to think about contributing. So we need to give them just that a little piece of emotional information. If you have a finite number of stories to work with, I can see just pulling out a really compelling quote and using that as one of your appeals to kind of reiterate it. So the appeal focuses on the impact, but that testimonial of how the work is supporting individuals just serves that illustration. And maybe another version having a more expanded story that takes you through the process. I also think of stories as being threaded into overarching narrative. So it's not sort of introduction and here's the story and therefore you should contribute, but where it sort of meanders in and out of the conversation, including some of the information about the work you're doing.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I feel like we've had a really awesome conversation about storytelling and crafting good stories and capturing good stories and using stories responsibly and thinking about how to apply stories. But there was there's a LinkedIn post I saw recently that has stuck with me that I thought you would have a really unique take on, and kind of the direction I'd like to take the second half of our conversation here is using stories to motivate internally as much as you use stories to motivate externally. Like we often, as fundraisers and as marketers, we're like, hey, that's a really interesting thing. I'm going to go tell all the people, all my donors or all my constituents or all my volunteers, or even the people I serve, I'm going to go tell everyone about that story. And I think that internal communication, the people focused internally, the people who are actually delivering the services and doing the work, often get neglected. How do you approach motivating teams internally with the same type of storytelling that we often are so good at doing externally?
That's an excellent question, David. I don't know why we delineate between employees and donors and constituents, because we're dealing with the same set of humans. And if anything, these individuals chose to work for your organization and your cause. I believe it's very easy to lose sight of why we do what we do, just being busy and trying to get things done in the course of the day. Sometimes it's very easy to forget the why behind it. So that's where I see stories and mission moments and kind of taking that pause to reflect on the difference you're making in the course of the day. It's incredibly motivating to staff to just be reminded of that. You read so many articles about people looking for professional lives that have a meaning and how do you build alignment behind the mission? Well, that's a built-in feature of working at a nonprofit organization. It doesn't have to be your one and only cause that you personally are most compelled by, but you obviously have to be a mission-oriented individual. So sometimes asking colleagues and staff members to share their own mission moments. So rather than doing the storytelling yourself, allowing others to reflect on moments that might be meaningful to them and validating that experience. Again, coming back to a story doesn't have to be this epic tale with beginning, middle, and ending. It's a moment, it's a snapshot. And hearing your peer, your colleague sharing something can be incredibly compelling. I'll never forget, one of my coworkers was describing something, sharing information for possible future use. And in telling that story, she got choked up, seeing the impact of the work they were doing on the family that was helped. Just really, she almost had tears in her eyes in sharing it with her colleagues and peers. And that raw emotion and that very real connection just impacted everybody on that Zoom call to an extent like nothing else would. Nothing somebody could put on a piece of paper and plan around.
I want to think back in the context of giving season. We know right now all of our friends working at nonprofit organizations, specifically fundraisers, marketers, storytellers, are running around with their hair on fire. It is crunch time, however you want to categorize it. It is peak busiest time of the year for fundraisers, between massive amounts of appeals, marketing campaigns, galas, events, dinners, meetings, delivering services. A lot of organizations have special events that they host during the holiday season. How can we use good storytelling to keep the motivation and engagement of our peers at our organization?
Yeah, I think some of it is it's sort of a two pieces to this equation. Your fundraisers on the front lines may not always be the ones that interact with people that you're supporting. So equipping them with stories that they can share and the impact that they can share with donors or volunteers, et cetera, can be really phenomenally helpful. Some of it will depend on culture of your organization, where certain things feel very authentic and real to who you are at one organization may seem a little bit contrived somewhere else. So I think you have to stay true to your organizational approach to things. So in one organization, maybe it's an all staff conversation where a series of stories are shared. Maybe it's your internal Slack or internal Teams chat where you're sharing those stories. And it's also sharing in the victories. I think when we talk about stories, just making sure that we don't pigeonhole them in kind of the narrative and the journey of an individual, but also the story of the impact that we're having. It's incredibly compelling when a colleague shares, maybe it's a legislative win, maybe it's a particularly compelling achievement in service area. So stories can take a little bit of a different form, and success begets success. It's motivating to see your peers and colleagues align. So it kind of creates the sense of we're together in it and we're making a difference. So I do rely on kind of sharing of those moments as well. And then finally, it's celebrating the people of the organization that you're at and moments in our work lives, right? So it may not always be these grand gestures, but that's what we do day in and day out. So somebody sharing, hey, here's a thing that happened. I just wanted to share it with you, and creating that culture where it's not only accepted, but it's welcome, I think really is a motivating thing for people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there was a time, and I'm going to go way back to the beginning of COVID. I don't want to sit there too long because I don't want to remember too much of that time. But I was working with an organization and we were putting the final touches on, it was March and they're a ministry. So Easter's a big deal for them. We were putting the final touches on their big Easter campaign. Their two office headquarters are San Francisco and New York. So they were in the epicenter of the epicenter when it comes to COVID, and no one really knew what was going to happen. We knew the campaign that we had planned, the efforts that we had planned, the events that we had planned, they weren't going to happen at this point. We were this just isn't going to happen. And it doesn't feel authentic to just try and push through with what we were doing, even though we don't really know. At that time, it was we're going to lock everything down for 2 weeks and we're going to go back. But the executive director and the president penned an internal memo. And he basically said, we don't know what's going to happen, but we can trust that God is going to carry us through this. And all we can do right now is pray. So join me, join your peers, join us together to pray for our organization, pray for the people we serve, pray for our donors, our constituents, our supporters, pray for the people around us, our communities. And we stopped and we said, hey, this is really true and authentic. It motivated your staff internally. Can we send this to everyone, right? Can we take this story that you told that was really moving? Can we send it to your donors and your constituents and your supporters and your board members? Can we send it to everyone? Because we're all moved. Maybe it'll move them. And it ended up being the most successful fundraising campaign that we ran for the entire year. Now, that was COVID year. Everything is different. I'm not saying send every internal memo from your executive director to everyone because that's a formula for success. But what I'm trying to get to is hey, this really moving story that was told, this moment that happened authentically, we were able to repurpose and use in other channels to communicate and engage authentically. So as we're planning and everyone is listening to this is neck deep in planning for their year-end strategy and their Giving Tuesday through year-end strategies, is when you find that really juicy story, what are good ways to compound the impact by telling it uniquely through different channels?
I think the word that you kept coming back to, and I appreciate that, is authenticity. The beauty of authenticity is that it really connects us. The tough part about authenticity is that you can't plan for it, right? Mm-hmm. It happens very organically. I think it's having that lens of, this sound real? Does this sound authentic? Or does it feel contrived? And not being afraid to walk away from something that doesn't feel really true to what it is. in terms of channels, I mean, the answer is it depends, right? So if you have an executive who's very passionate and the storyteller and just has a very strong presence, maybe it's video. If you have a message that's best conveyed in writing, maybe it's in writing. But I think it's also not being afraid to not use something if it doesn't fit. If it's a case of a round hole, square peg, or square peg, round hole, if something doesn't fit, even if it's wonderful, it's not trying to kind of shove it in there because it is so terrific. LinkedIn is a wonderful space for those types of stories that feel a little bit more internal, and it motivates, even though it's an external communications channel, it's also motivating to internal staff because that's who sees it a lot of the times. So those could be ways to leverage it. But I think it's really about looking out for those moments, those nuggets of gold, because they happen all the time. So it's a question of capturing them, and it's a question of paying attention and listening, and then being thoughtful about it, but walking in with an open mind if it makes sense. And the way you described it, everything just aligned in the right way, given the context and everything else. It's employing that, but not being afraid to walk away if it doesn't fit.
I think that piece is critical that you just touched on is having the courage to lean into a story, but also having the courage to walk away from a story or walk away from a campaign or walk away from a message if it's not resonating or if it's not the right message for the right channel at the right time. And understanding that, particularly with today's donors, today's constituents, and the people that down to the people that we serve, the expectation from an organization is to communicate to them like they would from any for-profit organization, where messaging sits at the rate of a news cycle, which is barely more attention than a goldfish at this point. But it's so important to be able to have not just the insight to know when something isn't landing, but the authority to be able to say, hey, this isn't landing, let's pivot. Olga, I am really grateful for the conversation we had today. So many great ideas, so many great ways to build resonating stories, to engage not just externally your constituents and donors and people you serve or the communities you serve, but also engage internally and keep that motivation so high, specifically during this season when things are crazy, but also like just generally. It's a great way to increase engagement, increase job satisfaction. I know we have such a crisis on our hands with employee turnover, and there's a lot of talk about the retention rate of donor retention and that being the crisis, but we have an equal crisis of internal retention and staff retention. This is a great way to keep staff retained and motivated and engaged and combat burnout. So Olga, I have one last question for you. Really practical. One thing for someone to do, like if they're listening now, like, hey, I need one idea to get me through fundraising season. What's your go-to? Someone came to you and asked like, hey, what should I do right now to win this fundraising season? What's that like one big idea that you would share?
Just one, huh? I think it's keeping focus on why you're doing what you're doing and not getting too attached to how you've always done things. It's not innovation for the sake of innovation, but if we kind of hitch our wagon to how things have always worked, we're kind of giving up that ability to think critically and innovatively. So I would say just take everything with a grain of salt. Everything is up for discussion. Everything is up for negotiation. And just really think of it as, what is the best course of action? What do I think will produce the best possible outcome?
Awesome. Well, Olga, thank you so much for your time today. To those who are listening, Olga is really active on LinkedIn. I highly recommend you go find her, follow her. She's got great thoughts, great stories, great inspiration. I learn a lot just engaging with your posts on LinkedIn. But outside of LinkedIn, if someone wanted to connect with you, what would be the best way to reach you?
Well, they'll probably find me on the running trail. That's probably the best place. But short of that, lemon-skies.com is where you can find me, or just Google Lemon Skies and you will get connected.
Awesome. Thank you, Olga.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. This podcast is brought to you by your friends at Funraise, nonprofit fundraising software built for nonprofit people by nonprofit people. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find me on LinkedIn or text me at 714-717-2474. And don't forget to get your next episode the second it hits the internets. Find us on your favorite podcast streaming service, hit that follow button, and leave us a review to help us reach more nonprofit people like you. See you next time.